All right, let's jump into something pretty interesting today.
Sounds good.
We're doing a deep dive today on the California independence movement.
Wow.
And we've got a ton of, well, not a ton,
Right.
but we've got some interesting articles and research that you sent over to me.
Yes.
Specifically focusing on two groups that are trying to make Collexit happen.
Okay.
Yes, California and the current Collexit movement.
Right.
So let's kind of unravel this together. I
Yeah.
think this will be pretty fascinating for the listeners out there.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have these two groups, and they both have their own unique approach, obviously,
Right.
to try to achieve a goal that seems practically impossible.
Right.
And I think it's important to just be upfront right off the bat. Constitutionally speaking, California secession is a non-starter.
Yeah, so right off the bat, we are debunking the myth that California can just up and leave the U.S.
Exactly.
But that doesn't make these movements any less interesting.
Right.
Like, why are people even entertaining this idea? What's driving these groups?
Well, Yes, California, the one that kind of popped up around 2017,
Yeah.
really seemed to ride that wave of anti-Trump sentiment.
Okay.
And if you look at their leader, Louis Marinelli, he presented himself as like a U.S. activist,
Right.
But there's a twist to that.
Okay.
He was actually living in Moscow and married to a Russian woman.
Hold on. So the guy leading a movement to split California from the U.S. was living in Russia.
Correct.
That's a bit ironic, isn't it? I mean, doesn't that raise some eyebrows about their true intentions?
Well, it certainly adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, you have Marinelli's Moscow residency,
Right.
It really throws a wrench into Yes, California's claims of wanting to have this sort of, this very American ideal of self-determination.
Right.
So it makes it hard to take their secession calls at face value.
Yeah.
There are definitely some questions about potential foreign influence, hidden agendas.
Right.
And ultimately, Yes, California fizzled out in 2024.
Okay.
They were unable to achieve their goals.
So that makes the current Collexit movement even more intriguing.
Yeah.
They're actively gathering signatures for a 2028 ballot initiative, right?
Correct.
So what's their angle?
Well, they're spearheaded by Marcus Ruiz Evans,
Okay.
who is a progressive liberal who believes that California's left-leaning politics are actually the reason why, or the thing that's pushing the state towards secession.
Interesting.
And his own story kind of adds another layer to all of this as well. He's a former Marine turned vocal critic of U.S. military interventions.
So you've got two very different leaders, different motivations, a whole lot of complexity.
Right.
But one thing that really jumped out at me from the materials you shared is how much California's financial situation seems to be fueling this whole secessionist sentiment.
Absolutely.
What's the connection there?
Well, I mean, California's financial struggles are a big piece of this whole puzzle, right? I mean, under Governor Newsom, the state went from having a $100 billion surplus
Oh, wow.
to a $30 billion deficit.
Yeah. That's
I mean, that's a pretty drastic shift,
it's a big swing.
and people are feeling it.
And then you throw in the recent Los Angeles wildfires, which, have added hundreds of billions in damages to the state's tab.
Exactly.
Talk about a strain on the budget.
Yeah.
It's no wonder people are looking for answers, even if those answers seem pretty far-fetched,
Yeah, it's almost as if they're looking for a life raft in the middle of this financial storm.
Right.
But it's not just the overall economic picture, It's
Yeah.
also about specific projects and how the money is being spent.
Okay.
Like take, for example, the high-speed rail project.
Oh, yeah.
Over $60 billion, not a single usable track has been laid.
Yeah, that project has definitely drawn its fair share of criticism.
Yeah.
And it just feels like a classic example of government overspending and broken promises. I mean, you'd think that with such a massive budget shortfall, and maybe reevaluating the priorities of these large-scale projects would be a good idea.
You would think so?
Yeah.
And then you have, the fact that despite needing federal aid for wildfire recovery, Newsom allocated $50 million to fight federal immigration policies.
Wait, so the state is battling the federal government while simultaneously asking for their help.
Exactly.
Isn't that a bit contradictory? How can the state fight federal policies while simultaneously asking for federal aid? It seems like that kind of disconnect is exactly what's fueling people's frustration and pushing them towards these more extreme ideas like secession.
It certainly isn't helping to ease the tension, that's for sure.
Right.
It makes people feel like their priorities aren't being addressed, and it adds fuel to the fire of these movements.
Right.
But are they really about secession, Or are they just a way for people to vent their frustration?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a deeper dissatisfaction simmering beneath the surface here.
Right.
Could these movements be tapping into something more than just this desire to leave the U.S.?
They could be.
Yeah.
This dissatisfaction might be a reaction to just the broader political and economic landscape in California.
So it's not just about the money.
Right.
There are deeper political currents at play here.
Absolutely. I mean, California's financial woes are closely tied to its political trajectory.
Okay.
The state has been leaning further and further to the left, and that's causing friction.
Which makes me think about something else. We've got these secession movements, a struggling economy, but what about the overall political landscape in California?
Right.
How does that play into all of this?
Well, California's political landscape is definitely a key part of this whole story.
Oh,
It's
right.
like we're seeing this microcosm of the national political divide playing out right here in the Golden State.
Right. And it seems like this divide is getting wider, not narrower.
Yeah.
Is California's shift to the left actually pushing people towards these secessionist ideas?
I think it's definitely a contributing factor.
Okay.
As California embraces these more progressive policies, you see a growing sense of alienation,
Right.
particularly among residents in these more rural areas
Yeah.
who feel like their values aren't being represented.
It's like they feel left behind by the very state they call home.
Right.
It's just they're seeing their state turn into something they don't recognize.
And this trend isn't unique to California.
Oh, really?
We see similar rumblings in places like Oregon and Illinois,
Oh,
where folks are feeling increasingly disconnected from the direction their states are heading.
So it's not just a California thing.
Right.
It's a symptom of a larger national trend.
Exactly.
This polarization, this sense of us versus them, it seems to be seeping into every corner of the country.
It is, and this division isn't just between states.
Right.
It's happening within parties, too.
Oh, wow.
Look at the Democratic Party itself.
Yeah.
The rise of progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC, as she's often referred to.
Right.
And her group, known as the Squad,
Right.
really highlights this growing rift between the progressive and moderate wings of the party.
Right. And even Nancy Pelosi,
Yeah.
who was once such a powerful figure in the Democratic Party,
Exactly.
faced a challenge to her leadership from her former staffer, Chuck Rocha.
Right.
That really speaks volumes about the internal struggles within the party.
Absolutely.
And all of these internal struggles are playing out against the backdrop of California's financial woes,
Right.
creating this perfect storm for movements like Collexit to gain traction.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder if these movements are really about secession or if they're more about expressing this deep frustration with the status quo. But regardless of their end goal, it's clear that a lot of Californians are feeling unheard and unrepresented.
Absolutely. And that's a dangerous situation no matter what side of the political fence you're on.
Okay, so we've got these secession movements.
Right.
It's a state grappling with financial troubles and this deep political divide.
Right.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
But let's bring it back to our listener for a second.
Okay.
How does all of this directly impact their life in California?
Well, for starters, think about the rising cost of living.
Yeah,
California is already one of the most expensive states in the nation.
for sure.
And the financial instability we've been discussing is only going to make things worse.
Right, and it's not just the cost of housing, it's everything.
Everything.
Groceries, gas, utilities. It's like everything seems to be going up.
Yep.
It's no wonder people are feeling the squeeze.
And then you've got the wildfires,
Right.
which are becoming more frequent and more destructive. And one thing I've noticed personally is the impact on insurance premiums.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I mentioned earlier, my insurance went up 22%
Wow.
because of this increased risk of wildfires.
Yeah.
So that's just one example,
So these aren't just these abstract political debates. They're having real-world consequences for everyday Californians.
Exactly.
And it seems like this trend is just going to continue, right?
Yeah.
What does the future hold for California? Let's assume for a moment that secession is completely off the table.
Okay.
What are some potential scenarios?
Well, one possibility is that, California just continues on its current trajectory,
Okay.
with the state leaning further to the left politically. This could lead to even greater alienation of certain groups and potentially just exacerbate the existing divisions we've been talking about.
And that could have some pretty serious consequences, right?
Oh, absolutely.
If people continue to feel like their voices aren't being heard, that their state is no longer representing their values,
Right.
It could lead to further instability and unrest.
For sure.
Right.
On the other hand, we could see a course correction.
Hmm.
Perhaps there's a shift in political ideology, a move toward these more moderate policies that address the concerns of a wider range of Californians.
So a kind of middle ground emerges where people feel like their concerns are being addressed,
Exactly.
and the state starts to pull itself back from the brink of this extreme political divide.
Exactly. It's about finding common ground and working together to create a more sustainable and equitable future for all Californians.
Right.
But there's another possibility, one that's perhaps even more intriguing.
Okay.
What if instead of breaking apart, California becomes even more fragmented?
Fragmented. What do you mean by that?
What if instead of one California, we see the emergence of several mini Californias?
Okay.
Not in the sense of actual physical secession,
Right.
but in terms of political and ideological alignment.
So you're talking about like a United States of California where
Okay.
different regions essentially govern themselves
Right.
based on their own values and priorities?
Precisely.
Interesting.
It's an idea that reflects this growing desire for autonomy and self-determination.
So rather than like a clean break, it's more like California kind of evolves into this collection of self-governing regions,
Right.
each with its own unique character and political leanings. That's a fascinating concept.
Yeah.
It's almost like the state acknowledges its internal divisions and just adapts to them.
Right. And it's not as far-fetched as it might sound. I
Right.
mean, we already see a degree of regionalism in California.
Sure.
The Bay Area, Southern California, the Central Valley,
Right.
they each have their own distinct identities.
Yeah.
And they often clash over issues like water rights, economic development, environmental policies.
It's like the seeds of this United States of California are already there, just waiting to sprout.
Right.
And maybe that's a more realistic outcome than outright secession.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to break apart completely,
Right.
California finds a way to embrace its diversity and allow different regions to chart their own course.
It's certainly a possibility worth considering.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this broader question. How do we as a society navigate these increasingly complex and often conflicting identities and values?
Right.
It's a challenge that goes beyond California.
Yeah.
It's something the entire nation,
Right.
and indeed the world, is grappling with.
It makes you wonder if this whole secession movement,
Yeah.
as radical as it might seem,
Right.
is actually forcing us to confront some pretty fundamental questions
Mhm.
about what it means to be a nation,
Yeah.
a state,
Community.
a community, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it's a wake-up call, a sign that we need to find new ways to bridge these divides and
Right.
create a more inclusive and representative system.
Perhaps. And it highlights the importance of listening to those who feel marginalized and unheard.
Yeah.
Even if their proposed solutions seem extreme, their grievances often point to real issues that need to be addressed.
So to our listener out there, we're leaving you with a lot to think about.
We are.
We've explored the motivations behind the California independence movement,
Right?
delved into the state's financial and political challenges,
Mm-hmm.
and even considered some alternative futures for California. But the conversation doesn't end here.
This is just the beginning.
Right.
This deep dive is just a springboard for further exploration.
Right.
We encourage you to continue researching, questioning, and engaging with these issues.
Don't just take our word for it.
Right.
Dig deeper.
Yeah.
Form your own opinion.
Exactly.
And a part of the solution.
Be a part of the conversation.
Right.
Absolutely.
So think about it. What does the future of California look like to you?
Yeah.
Is it a state, united, divided, or something in between?
And how does California's experience reflect the broader trends we see happening across the nation and around the world?
Yeah.
These are questions that deserve our attention, our critical thinking,
Right.
and our willingness to engage in constructive dialogue.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the California independence movement.
Absolutely.
We hope it's sparked your curiosity and given you some new perspectives to ponder.
For sure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.